Perkins versus the LXR-02 might at first seem like an odd pair to match up against each other. After all, if you didn't want Perkins, wouldn't you be considering one of the others from the big five of drum machines? And the big five I consider to be Perkins, the Modor DR2, the Jomox Alpha Bass, the Somar Pulsar 23, and the Electron machine with the stupid name Mark II. But isn't it nice if you discover something much cheaper that does everything you want? Which brings us to Perkins versus the LXR-02. Let's get the bleeding obvious out of the way first, and that is that Perkins is big. With all these wonderful knobs and 4 lanes of sequencing, of course, it's got to be big. If you're playing live, will your live interaction be worth all the extra space it takes and the extra lug? And unless you own your own private little synth museum, Perkins is such a dominator of the landscape that if it's in your zone of operation, it will demand attention. It's like if you parked a tank in your backyard or you had a grand piano in your studio. A big presence generates big expectations, not just with visitors or an audience, but I think with yourself. Whereas the LXR is so small it can sit quietly to one side, and if it isn't always the star, well, that's fine, no one's going to feel let down. So give this factor some genuine consideration, because I think it's more than just big versus small. There's some interesting psychology in there that could even affect how much you use a drum machine in your music. Now, analog versus digital is a big deal in synthland. Here, though, they're both really just digital machines. I mean, Perkins certainly feels more analog. The lack of a screen makes you use it in a more analog way, especially when it comes to tuning. And with Perkins, if you're going to try to tune something in here, you're going to need a tuner or tune it by ear. With the LXR-02, here you've got the coarse tuning, and every 12 steps in coarse tuning is an octave. So that makes it very easy. And Perkins does have analog filters, but whether that really makes a big difference to you, or you think it makes a big difference to the sound, well, maybe. We'll look at filters more generally in a moment. First of all, on the interface itself, Perkins is famous for its knobs, 44 big grippable knobs plus 14 switches and 79 buttons, so we could say 137 points of interface. The LXR has 5 knobs, 7 sliders and 41 buttons. That's a total of 53 points of interface, so it's still a lot to work with. And harder to quantify is the LXR-02's screen. Now, if you don't like screens or see them as a point of failure for the future, or that screens are just a buzz killer, then obviously that's going to be a big minus. On the other hand, it does enable things like instant precision. For example, with the LFO, you want to set the frequency manually, or you want to sync it to a certain rate, you want to set a modulation depth, a shape, re-trigger, offset, which is the phase offset, what voice is it going to affect, the destination. Well, this is all very quickly done with a screen. Assuming, of course, you know what to do and you know where to go, which is another matter. Perkins only has one LFO for direct voice modulation, so you never really run into the problem of managing multiple sources of modulation. So let's see how it works. And you see here modulation destination and modulation depth. For each of these 4 voices, the first one is tuning. So if you wanted to change the tuning of voice number 1, give it a depth. This is how deep the modulation will be. Then over here, you've got a modulation master depth. You've got the wave shape, and then you've got the time and the little indicator light. So if we slow that down, put that on a sine wave, we've got a good depth. Turn up the tuning. Give it more depth. Less depth. Sync it to the clock. And then you can add in more modulation. So for example, you might want parameter 1 modulation for voice 3. So now it's going to be modulating this parameter, and you give that a depth. A modulation that suits this parameter for this voice maybe is no longer going to be suiting this voice and this amount of modulation. So you might have all these destinations and you can give them all a different amount of modulation, but they are all coming off this single LFO. So nice to have all those options, but whether one LFO on multiple modulation destinations is really going to suit is another thing entirely. Whereas the LXR has 6 LFOs which you can assign where you like. So for example, if you wanted to have all your LFOs routed to voice number 2, then you just go through, put them all to voice number 2, and then suddenly you're going to be having multiple LFOs affecting a single voice. Or you could keep it one for each one, whatever you like. But certainly it gives you a lot of flexibility. So Perkins does have a second LFO, and that's here for the modulation depth and the modulation rate, and it affects the delay. So got it, giving it a good depth there. And it's interesting, but how often you'd really want to use that is another question. And really, that's all it does. Let's look at some other aspects of the interface. A huge plus for Perkins is the 4 lanes of step buttons. They're soft, they've got a nice click, they feel sure and satisfying, and of course you can instantly see exactly what's happening on all the voices. It's wonderful, it's beautiful, it's a joy to use, and for me it's probably the best part of Perkins. And against that, the LXR has these hard little nubs that don't feel anywhere near as satisfying or high quality. They're the same ones as the DB01 baseline uses. After extremely heavy use on the DB01, I have found that 1 or 2 of them have started to stick a bit. No problems here. And really, they're quite serviceable. They're just not as nice as these. And one other area where Perkins does get some criticism is for being mono. I don't really see that as significant. If you want stereo, you just take one of the 4 individual outs and process that for some stereo movement. And it's a little bit messy, but not too painful, especially since you'll probably want to use an individual out for at least 1 or 2 voices anyway. Now the LXR has 2 stereo pairs, which you can treat as 4 mono outs. And it's more flexible in that individual voices can be assigned anywhere in that left or right field. So for example, let's take the bass drum here. We've got panning, negative for left and positive for right. So if you wanted to, you could go through each voice, say that one's a bit left and this one's a bit right and that one's all the way right. And then with the stereo out, then you could take left as a mono out and right as a mono out, and now you've got panning. So in effect, you've got two mono outputs each with a different mix of these instruments, quite separate from the faders, which then could add in another dimension, and that could potentially be rather interesting and flexible. Another thing you could do would be to have a voice currently panned center. You could take the LFO, give it a frequency, modulation, depth, make it a sine wave, destination, voice panning, and now we're getting panning across that stereo field. So that sort of thing you're obviously not going to get with Perkins, but you can get with something that's got stereo outs. So that might be important to you. Now Perkins starts you off with a very strong defining waveform. So actually let's take voice 2. And with those starting sounds, you've got two parameters, 1 and 2, which change according to the algorithm. So just by selecting the algorithm and moving these two knobs, parameter 1 and parameter 2, you're already halfway to your final sound. And some of these starter waves are more complex than you're going to be able to get even with some deep tweaking on the LXR-02. So let's go clear kit. That puts all the controls in what Erica Synth calls manual override, so it's a WYSIWYG mode. So now whatever these knobs are on is the sound you're going to get, which can sometimes be a little bit unusual, but interesting. Now going through them, I've got to say, I think the selection is quirky. Always interesting though, but definitely a bit quirky. It's not like you're going to be dialing in tom number 1 and tom number 2 and then a conga. They're quite unusual. Now with the LXR, if we load an initialized kit, the sounds you get are generously described, I think, as generic, maybe bland, maybe even a bit weak. And it's going to be up to you to try to get something a little bit more a bit more exciting. Let's just load that initialized kit again. Your starting point is voices 1 to 3 are just called drum voices. They're all the same synth engines. 4 is snare, 5 is clap or cymbal, and 6 is hats. And there's a 7th fader there for open hats, but open hat is just the closed hat sound, but you also get a decay parameter. Now these are obviously just labels, and what you actually end up programming on each of them is going to be entirely up to you. The interesting thing really, I think, is that these different voices have different parameters, so that, for example, the snare doesn't have FM, but voices 1 to 3 do. And there's little differences like that between the voices, which makes things a bit interesting. Let's just reload our other little kit that I like. Actually, you see, I've been playing with trying to get a CR78, and I don't know. I've been too successful yet. And one other important difference between the two machines is the parameter lock functionality, or you could call it per step automation. Now, if you're using this as a major way to shape the sound, it's also important to note that these changes on the Perkins are stored as part of the pattern and not part of the kit, which is sort of obvious, but it becomes important, I think, when you're designing sound, because with the LXR, for example, instead of automation and per step automation, which it can do, not as good as Perkins, but it has got it. We'll get onto that in a second. But for the weirdness or the interesting modulation movements in the sound, you're much more liable, I think, to use the LFOs in the LXR, which means those modulations and differences step to step are going to be baked into the kit, and it's not going to be baked into the kit with Perkins. But it is very beautiful what it does. Let's have a look. So we'll just do. So you can put it into record mode, and now whatever you do to any sound is going to be So, dog's breakfast there, but just to give you the idea that you have a pattern playing, you start moving things, you go, a bit more of that, a bit less of that. It evolves as you do it. And quiet you. And if you want to go in and go, well, actually, you know, this should have been up here, and this one should have been there, and this one should have been here, you can adjust it that way instead. As I mentioned before, you can then go, well, instead of this kit, maybe this kit would sound good, but with all that automation still in place, you're suddenly getting all these completely different sounds and effects with that first bit of automation that you did. Now the LXR can get close to this sort of thing. Okay, let's see what we've ended up with there. Well, it's sounding even worse, I think. So now we'll go shift voice, hit that twice. Now here's two automation options for these. Destination of value for both. So on this one we'll go destination. Oh, it's a bit hard to see, so okay, sample rate, that's alright. Value, whatever. For this second step, let's do something we can actually tell the difference with. Filter frequency, value here. Next step, destination, sample rate 1, this one over here. So you can see you can have per step automation and you can get very detailed, but it's pretty tedious compared with the incredibly fast work on the Perkins. And we've ended up with something pretty horrible anyway, but you can see how it works. I think in a lot of ways, if you want to adjust the sounds on the LXR, much easier to go in and use the LFO to do it rather than use automation. Now we've looked at some of the quirky voice choices for Perkins, and they do give it an instantly recognizable sound. It's usually pretty easy to pick out on a track, although I would say that one of the reasons is this knob here, which is the parameter 2 knob, and if I start to turn it on this sound, you'll see exactly what I mean. How often, over here, how often do you hear that sound on Perkins? And I submit, Your Honour, you hear it all the time. The pitch envelope amount is pretty common to the algorithms as the option for parameter 2, and I think because it's so easy to do and it gives you that sort of zappy thing straight away, it seduces you into using it, and that is the Perkins sound. Now, since we're looking at knob functions though, let's look at this a little bit more critically than just going, oh, look at how many knobs there are. So for each voice you've got tuning, you've got decay, which we'll come back into in a minute. One of the things about the decay is that at the top you get into the drone functionality, which is nice. Turn it all the way up and suddenly you've got a beautiful 4-voice drone machine. Hook up a MIDI keyboard to it. Now you can have chromatic control over the drones. Interesting though, the LXR has exactly the same thing. There is bass drum. You put that up to 127. And that will drone forever as well with all the sounds. So if you want a drone machine, the LXR can drone as well. Choices you've got here are not that huge. I mean, effects send, okay, well if you want delay, there it is, volume, well, okay. Drive amount, it's often used like a volume boost, but you certainly wouldn't call it a vicious drive or distortion, that's for sure. The cutoff, well, Okay, so you've got high pass, band pass, low pass as your filter choices. So, yeah, you know, pretty basic, no resonance, sadly enough. The 2 parameter knobs, then you've got tuning and decay. So really not an array of knobs which interact or give you any sort of interrelationship between the voices. No sync, no FM, no cross modulation. There's no way that one voice affects another voice. Now that's not to criticize the selection of knobs. I mean, after all, if you have a drum synth, what are you going to do? I mean, you've got to have filter, you've got to have level, effects, send, tuning, decay. I mean, they're all things that are absolutely necessary. But it does mean that you miss out on some of the finer controls. Like, for example, decay is just a very simple decay, and although if you choose different algorithms, you'll find that the decay profile changes. So what's short somewhere may be long somewhere else, depending on what sound you've got. But it is still just a single control. Now, if we compare that to the LXR, well, let's take the little snare sound again. So we've got a decay, we've also got a slope, which goes from the very sharp exponential to linear to, I think, logarithmic. And you can hear that is like a gate being held open, and how long this is held open depends upon this decay amount. Then you've got an attack setting, or you might put this down back to a linear shape. And then you've got repeats. So how many times it'll hit within this attack time. So that's all pretty interesting. And then you've also got a Pitchmod envelope as well, which operates in the same way as this envelope. So massively more envelope control on the LXR. Now, since we're twiddling knobs, let's talk about the knob calibration, specifically to do with the filters. So here is this filter. It's on low pass. Now, at about halfway, there's not much. Look at all this travel, nothing happening, nothing happening, nothing happening. And halfway before we get much. By the time we're at 3/4, we're at maximum. So there's only about a quarter of this knob travel, which is significant in any way. Let's go to high pass. Not much change, beginning to hear a change. Up it goes. That's about the end of that show. So there's all this travel here, which is not significant either. And in band pass, well, not terribly much usable range. Now, just to show you I'm not unfairly picking on a particular sound, let's find something else that here, low pass. Again, about halfway. 3/4 it's on. The rest of it, not much different. Let's go to high pass. Not much change. Kicking in. Nothing happening really in the last quarter. So knob calibration, not terribly excited with. Let's go back to the LXR, reload that kit on the snare sound. Let's go into the filters. We're on a peak filter. So let's go down to the bottom. Here we are, better view. So I would argue that we're getting stuff happening over the full range. Let's try high pass. Now we've got 7 different filter types, which is very nice as well, and resonance, of course. So here we are, high pass. So, to my mind, we're getting a much better range, much better value out of the filter. Now, also have a listen to this notch filter on the kick. It's a beautiful thing. So just a few little twiddles, and we have all these nice flavors. Let's zoom out a bit and think about the firmware. Now, Perkons firmware certainly feels solid as far as it goes, and you also know that over time there will be some new sound sources and functionality. Not all the sound slots in Perkons are used. In the last firmware update they did add a digital noise sound, which was very welcome, and I'm sure more of those to come. They also modified the odds functionality so that the optional hits come at the end of a playthrough instead of at the beginning. They also put in the chromatic MIDI control, so you can play it as a synth, but you can play the LXR as a synth as well. Now, the LXR's firmware, it hasn't had an update as of the time of this video in just over a year. I did try to get some info on what's going to happen. There's one particular fellow who I believe is in charge of the LXR firmware. He's really the brains trust for planet Earth when it comes to LXR firmware. Unfortunately, couldn't get a reply out of him, so who knows what's happening. It's currently at 1.6. It can do a hell of a lot, but there's some holes in it, there's some bugs in it. For example, the song functionality in the LXR is broken. You go into shift song to get into song mode. It's a pretty clunky old thing to use anyway. Oh god. I'm sure there's a quicker way to get to the top. I don't know what it is. So here we are at 0, and you say, well, I want pattern 1 to play, then I want pattern 2 to play, then I want pattern 3 to play. Okay, very nice. But if we actually then go in and see what it's done, it said play pattern 0, pattern 1, and pattern 2. Yeah, but we put in 1, 2, and 3. So there's a fundamental problem in that it puts in patterns 1 less than what you think you're putting in. The fact that this bug isn't mentioned very much, I think, says a lot for how often song mode is used, but still, it's annoying. I mean, there's a few other firmware gripes with the LXR. I like to complain about the onboard effects. The tube distortion is completely unusable because it just squeals as soon as you stop the play. The delays are poor. It can't be synced to clock, which is pretty incredible, really. So we go for the effects, dry wet level, yes, very nice. Delay type, delay or ping pong. Okay, well, let's keep it on normal delay. Time, well, it goes from 0 to 127, and it's completely meaningless. So that's a bit iffy as well. Another fundamental issue is if we go load pattern. Okay, well, we're on pattern 8. Which of these patterns in this bank have got something on them? Well, who knows? The only way you can tell is to actually play the thing, and that will tell you. Actually, all of them have something here. The only way to tell is to actually play the thing, and that is potentially even worse if you go save pattern. Well, which slot is empty and which have you already used? Again, who knows? You've just got to know beforehand what's going on. And certainly because of that, I've overwritten various things and it's all pretty annoying. The save functionality, well, to be sure that you don't lose anything, you need to save the kit, then you need to save the pattern, and then you need to save the project, and that's the only way to be sure that you're not going to lose anything. So I don't know what the easy way around that would be, but it's certainly clumsy when you've got to do 3 saves to just ensure that you don't lose anything. With the Perkins, much easier. You can go into kit, you go, well, I like what we've done to the kit at the moment. This is the kit we're on, but I don't want to save it there. I want to save it and the one next to it. So now we've saved a copy of that kit there. And we go, well, the pattern, I've made various changes to it. It's here at the moment, but we've saved the kit there, so let's save the pattern here. So now the kit and the pattern match up, even though we haven't got them directly connected. Very elegant, very simple, very fast, and that can make a big difference. Your workflow and even just your confidence in using the machine. So with all this, we've still only barely looked at the basic functionality of these machines, and no doubt people would be saying, but you haven't even touched on the LXR's micro timing, or the ratchets, or that Perkins can speed up or slow down lanes. All true. Yet here we are at the conclusion, and with the conclusions, well, one man's revolting sea slug is another man's idea of fine dining, so it's all up to you. You didn't think I was actually going to say one's better than the other, did you? All I can say is that I think there's a few very obvious factors that are worth considering. Perkins is big. You can fit 4 LXRs into the Perkins footprint and still have room left over. So if studio space is an issue, or you need to lug gear to a venue and you hate lugging gear, then maybe the LXR is a good choice. There's an issue of commitment. Perkins is pretty simple to operate. You can be confidently banging away with huge sounds in an hour, but to get the best out of the LXR, you're going to need to learn how to program it, and the more time you put into learning it, the better it's going to sound. For the first few days, chances are you're probably just going to be a bit frustrated. Now, grunt, there's no doubt Perkins can really hit the low end. It can do it easily. You can get into the same territory with the LXR, but again, you're going to have to spend some time working at it. The interface, well, it's an obvious one. The biggest plus for Perkins, I think, are the knobs and the 4 lanes of steps. The LXR isn't even in the same league. Sound-wise, Perkins has a distinctive sound. It's a great sound, but if you want something different, then you're going to have to do some work with the Perkins. The LXR starts with a very generic sound. It's maybe even bland. It's up to you to create something interesting. Now, if you don't put the time into the LXR, you're going to have to rely on third-party kits. There's not a huge number of those available. The LXR does come with a reasonable selection of kits. You can just sort of tweak those. But again, the more effort you put in, the better it's going to sound. And finally, of course, cost. And as my daughter would say, well, Perkins is more than 3 times the price of an LXR. So for the price of a Perkins, you could get an LXR, an acid box, a Zen delay, and still have money left over to take your partner out to a fancy dinner to prove that you don't spend all your money on gear. So there it is. Please let me know in the comments how wrong I've been about just about everything. And until next time, see ya.